Under the pale sunlight of the late afternoon, David stood still before the garden hose in the expansive grounds of the mansion. His hand tightened around the handle, sending a stream of icy water forcefully onto Helen. She collapsed onto the wet grass, her entire body trembling. Her thin clothes, now drenched, clung to her frail frame. Yet Helen uttered no complaints, no words of protest escaped her pale lips. Instead, she looked downward, her eyes hiding a deep, unending pain and a remorse that could not be washed away. "Get up!" David commanded, his voice cold as a blade, cutting sharply through the damp air. Helen bit her lip, struggling to push herself up. Her weakened legs failed her, and she fell back onto the ground. I, I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice fragile, as faint as a wisp of smoke. David's gaze bore into her, his gray eyes burning with restrained fury. In his mind, he saw the image of his sister, Anna, with her radiant smile and loving eyes. The photograph of her still rested in the pocket over his heart, a constant reminder of why he had to do this, why he had to punish Helen mercilessly. "Sorry?" David let out a bitter laugh, but his eyes darkened, as deep as the chasm of painful memories. "Do you think your apology can bring Anna back?" Helen remained silent. She simply lowered her head, knowing she deserved every bit of this punishment. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Anna, the woman who had transformed her life, who had saved her from darkness. But she had never imagined that she would become the reason her savior had to leave this world forever. David and Anna had grown up in a wealthy family. Their parents died in an accident when David had just turned 18, leaving him with the heavy responsibility of caring for the family and protecting his younger sister, who was 3 years his junior. Anna was the light of David's life, the one he loved and protected with all his heart. As Anna grew up, she became a talented and respected doctor in the United States. Her colleagues admired her for her exceptional skills and dedication to her patients. Despite her successful career, Anna dedicated 5 years of her life to volunteering and helping impoverished communities in Africa. David, though worried, never stood in her way. David admired and was immensely proud of his sister. To him, Anna was not only a sibling, but a symbol of compassion and selflessness. When he received the devastating news of her murder, his world fell apart. His heart shattered and no comfort could ease the pain. Without hesitation, he flew to South Africa, driven by a single purpose: to find the person who had poisoned Anna and bring justice for his beloved sister. However, the South African police investigation led nowhere. They concluded that Anna had died from poisoning, but no clear clues about the culprit emerged. In his desperation, David received Anna's belongings from the authorities. As he held her laptop in his hands, a faint glimmer of hope sparked within him. He knew Anna often recorded her work activities in her office, videos that might hold crucial information. Then when he opened the video file from the day she was poisoned, 10 minutes before the fatal event, the scene in Anna's office unfolded. Anna was sitting at her desk, typing up a report on her computer. Helen entered the room, carrying a steaming cup of coffee. Her beautiful face glowed with a gentle smile, and her eyes sparkled as she looked at the woman who had saved her. Anna was busy reading some medical reports on her computer screen, but when she heard Helen's footsteps, she smiled and put the documents down. "Helen, you've brought me coffee again," Anna said, her eyes full of warmth. "I told you, you don't need to go out of your way." Helen smiled, setting the cup down on the desk. "It's no trouble, Anna. You've been working so hard. A little coffee might help keep you awake." Anna sighed, but the smile never left her face. "You're too kind. Sometimes I don't know how I'd manage without you here." Helen bowed her head, her voice soft. "You saved my life, Anna. I just want to give back, even if it's only in small ways." Anna gently placed her hand over Helen's. "You don't owe me anything, Helen. We're family. Never think you have to do something to repay me." Helen smiled, her eyes glistening with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. "You've always been so kind to me." She then left the room. Anna nodded and lifted the cup of coffee, inhaling the rich aroma with a satisfied expression. David stopped the video there. He couldn't watch any further. Rage exploded within him, like flames devouring his reason. He was convinced Helen was the one who killed Anna. At first, he considered handing her over to the authorities, but he believed that would be too lenient. Instead, he decided to bring her into his mansion, forcing her to work as a servant so he could inflict his own brand of justice for Anna. Helen had once lived a blissful life in America, cherished by her loving parents who gave her the best they could offer. Her childhood was filled with laughter and joy until a tragic accident turned her world upside down. When Helen was 10, her family embarked on a trip to South Africa, a vacation her parents hoped would create lasting memories. But fate had other plans. A horrific car accident claimed the lives of her parents, leaving Helen alone and stranded in a foreign land. With no relatives to turn to, she stayed in South Africa, surviving thanks to the kindness of strangers. Despite the hardships and the sense of isolation, Helen grew up resilient, holding on to her innate kindness and hope. She learned to fend for herself and never gave up on the belief that goodness could be found even in the darkest of times. It was this enduring spirit that kept her going, teaching her to care for herself and others. Her life took a turn when she met Anna, a compassionate American doctor who was volunteering in South Africa. Anna brought light back into Helen's life, offering her not just a job, but a sisterly bond Helen had long craved. To Helen, Anna was more than a savior. She was family. Anna, in turn, cared for Helen deeply, forming an unbreakable connection filled with mutual respect and love. Just as life seemed to be getting better, tragedy struck once more. Anna was poisoned, and Helen found herself accused, trapped in a nightmare of blame and suffering. David brought Helen back to his mansion under the pretense of her being a housemaid, but in reality, it was to punish her. He wanted her to feel the pain he believed his sister Anna had suffered. He relentlessly tormented Helen, both physically and mentally. Sometimes he would spray her with freezing cold water, the icy stream hitting her body until she trembled uncontrollably and her skin flushed red from the cold. "Do you know that no matter how many times you wash yourself, you'll never wash away your sins?" David roared, his voice filled with fury, as Helen collapsed to the ground, soaked and shivering. She didn't reply. Instead, she bowed her head, her tears mixing with the cold water that ran down her face. But his cruelty didn't stop there. David dug a large pit in the garden and forced Helen to stand in it while he gradually filled it with soil, leaving only her head exposed. "Do you have any idea what it feels like to die slowly in despair?" he whispered, his eyes dark with anguish. "Anna died like that, in agony and fear." Helen stood still, feeling the suffocating weight of the soil pressing down on her, fighting back the terror threatening to overwhelm her. She knew David would not spare her, and she felt she had no right to resist. The oppressive, hopeless feeling consumed her, but she uttered no pleas for mercy. She accepted her suffering, convinced that she deserved every bit of it. At night, when the cold of the mansion seeped into every corner, David made Helen sleep on the freezing marble floor in the hallway. She curled up, her teeth chattering uncontrollably, unable to find rest in the bone-chilling cold. "How does it feel?" David would approach, his voice as cold as the air. "Anna died cold and alone. Do you think you deserve the comfort of warmth?" Helen trembled but never protested. She closed her eyes and tears streamed down her cheeks. Each time she did, she saw Anna's face, smiling gently at her, haunting her endlessly like a ghost. "Do you know how much Anna cared for you?" David continued, his eyes blazing with hatred. "She loved you like a sister, and yet you betrayed her." Helen had no words. She silently bowed her head, her tears falling like rain. She couldn't defend herself, couldn't utter anything that might ease David's wrath. Helen vividly remembered carrying that cup of coffee to Anna on that fateful afternoon. She remembered every detail, brewing the coffee and then placing it in Anna's hands. The warm sunlight of that day had seemed to turn icy as Anna smiled and accepted the coffee without suspicion. But Helen couldn't understand how that harmless beverage could have been poisoned, how something she had prepared could have ended the life of the person she loved most. The image of Anna drinking that fatal coffee pierced Helen's heart with a pain as sharp as 1,000 needles. She had asked herself countless times, had she unwittingly killed Anna, even if she hadn't meant to? The thought tormented her, making her unable to forgive herself. This guilt enveloped Helen, turning her into a person who willingly accepted any punishment. When David punished her, When he sprayed her with freezing water until her skin burned or forced her to stand in the pit under the harsh sun, Helen never fought back. She accepted everything without complaint, without begging for relief. In her heart, she believed she deserved it. David's torment was just a fraction of the anguish she felt inside. "Do you think those tears can cleanse your sins?" David once shouted, his eyes blazing with fury as Helen knelt on the freezing stone floor. Helen remained silent, her head bowed. His words cut into her like knives, but she never dared to argue. She believed he had every right to hate her, every right to punish her, because she couldn't forgive herself. Helen couldn't explain why the coffee had been poisoned, but she refused to doubt herself any less. She had no answers, no excuses. Every night, as she lay curled up on the cold floor, she whispered prayers, begging Anna for forgiveness, even though she knew she might never be worthy of it. As time passed, despite the hatred consuming him, David began to notice that Helen wasn't the heartless killer he had imagined. She cooked meals for everyone with incredible care, her dishes not only delicious, but also imbued with a warmth that was difficult to describe. She made coffee with a skill that produced flavors so comforting it brought back memories of peaceful days when Anna was still alive. Yet the radiant smile she once had was long gone, replaced by a perpetual sadness. Her eyes always seemed to carry a deep sorrow, as if haunted by an unbearable weight. Nevertheless, Helen never ceased to show kindness and compassion. She looked after the staff in the mansion, offering help whenever someone struggled, never needing to be asked. One afternoon, as heavy rain poured down, David happened to look out the window and saw Helen giving her only umbrella to an elderly woman, choosing to stand in the downpour herself. Her thin frame shivered in the cold, but her eyes remained filled with genuine kindness. She even tenderly nursed a wounded puppy back to health, cradling it in her arms with the gentleness of a mother, even though she herself was subjected to such cruelty in the mansion. Every time David witnessed such acts, a seed of doubt sprouted within him. How could someone capable of such love and care really be a murderer? But he always forced himself to bury those thoughts, reminding himself that the evidence in the video was undeniable. "Are you pretending?" David snarled one day when he saw Helen laughing with the neighbor's children through the fence. The anger inside him flared like a wildfire. "Do you think I'll go easy on you? Do you think your little charades will make me forgive you?" Helen turned to him, her face still gentle but her eyes clouded with sadness. "I'm not pretending," she said softly and sincerely. "I'm just doing what Anna taught me. No matter what happens to me, I want to live the way she would have wanted." David said nothing, clenching his fist tightly, his heart a storm of conflicting emotions. He wanted to believe Helen was guilty, that she deserved his punishment. But whenever he looked into her earnest eyes, something inside him wavered. Her gentle actions contradicted the rage he harbored. But the harsh reality of the video always dragged him back, cutting him like a blade and reigniting his fury. His hatred burned fiercely, yet so did his inner conflict. One day while Helen was cleaning the garden, she slipped and fell into the pond. She thrashed around in a panic as she couldn't swim, her hands flailing desperately. David was lounging on a sun chair by the pool and watched as she struggled in the icy water. An inner battle raged within him. Save her or let her drown. "Helen!" David called out, his voice a mix of desperation and fear. In the end, he couldn't stand it any longer. He dove into the water and pulled her to safety. Helen lay shivering on the ground, her eyes wide with terror. Why didn't you just let me die?" she whispered, her voice trembling. David didn't reply, his gaze conflicted and tortured. "You think you can die that easily?" he said, his voice harsh. "You have to live and continue to pay for what you've done. This is the price you owe," he added, but his heart pounded wildly, and he couldn't tell if it was from hatred or the fear of losing her. The conflict in David's heart grew stronger each day. On one side was Helen, who displayed constant kindness and gentleness to everyone around her, and on the other was the brutal truth recorded in that video, a piece of evidence that couldn't be denied, showing Helen handing Anna the cup of coffee before his beloved sister took her final breath. David had watched that video dozens of times. Each time he opened his laptop, he would take a deep breath, trying to contain his emotions. But when the moment came, when Helen gently walked into the room, holding the cup of coffee and placing it in front of Anna, his anger would explode. "She's a murderer!" David would scream internally, and in a surge of rage, he would slam the laptop shut and storm off, trying to calm the fire of fury within him. Tonight was no different. Sitting alone in a dark room, with only the screen's glow illuminating his weary, tormented face, David's red-rimmed eyes burned with inner conflict as he pressed play on the video once more, like a ritual of self-inflicted torment. When the video reached the point where Helen walked into the room, placed the cup of coffee on the table, and smiled gently at Anna, David felt the familiar surge of anger. Helen bowed to Anna and left the room. David was about to shut off the video as he usually did, but a sudden ringing of his phone interrupted his thoughts. He picked up, his voice cold and impatient, exchanged a few hurried words, and then turned back to the screen, intending to close the video in his usual fit of rage. But something caught his eye, an unexpected movement. A dark-skinned nurse entered the room after Helen left. David sat back down, his heart pounding as he continued to watch. Anna had lifted the cup of coffee to her lips, but was called away by a patient, placing the cup back down on the table without taking a sip. After she left the room, the nurse sneaked in, her eyes darting around nervously. She swiftly took out a small packet of white powder and dumped it into Anna's coffee. The nurse vanished just as quickly, and a few minutes later, Anna returned, unaware of what had happened, picked up the coffee and drank it. "No, it can't be," David whispered, his entire body stiffening. He couldn't believe his eyes. His hands trembled, slowly falling to his sides, as a wave of dizziness washed over him. He had been wrong. All the anger and hatred he had directed at Helen had been based on a horrific misunderstanding. Helen was innocent. She hadn't killed Anna. He had tormented a pure, gentle soul, mercilessly hurting her because of his own wrongful judgment. "Oh my God," David murmured, his hands covering his face. Shame and regret flooded his heart, an overwhelming tide that left him breathless. What had he done? He had destroyed an innocent life, turning his own grief into a weapon of cruel retribution against someone who never deserved it. It felt as though thousands of needles were piercing his chest, suffocating him with the weight of his guilt. Outside the window, the night sky stretched out in darkness, mirroring the void in David's soul, shadowed and filled with an irredeemable sense of loss. But just as dawn always followed the darkest nights, he knew that a new journey had begun, one where he would have to atone for his sins, save Helen, and perhaps save himself. David stood up, his legs feeling heavy, but his resolve firm. He couldn't just sit there, wallowing in regret without doing anything. He needed to find Helen, to look into the eyes he had wrongfully condemned, and face the truth he had refused to see. He walked down the long hallway, where dim lights cast shadows on the cold, lifeless walls. When he reached the place where Helen slept, he stopped, feeling a pang of anguish twist his heart. Helen lay curled up, covered only by a thin blanket that did little to protect her from the bone-chilling cold. Her frail body shivered, her hands clasped together in front of her mouth, whispering in her sleep, "I'm sorry. Anna, please forgive me." The words were broken, fragile, and full of sorrow. David's heart clenched, the guilt stabbing at him like knives. What had he put this poor girl through? How much had she suffered and tormented herself while he blinded himself to the truth? He had been so lost in his own grief and rage that he failed to see the purity in her heart, had mercilessly driven her to the edge of despair. David bowed his head, tears welling in his eyes. He wanted to approach her, to wake her up and apologize, but the words choked in his throat, and shame bound him like invisible chains. Helen didn't deserve any of this. Now all he could do was try to make things right, even if he wasn't sure he could ever earn her forgiveness. "Helen," David whispered, but the sound of his voice was swallowed by his own agony, vanishing into the cold, empty space around them. He knew that his journey to atonement was only just beginning. The next morning, sunlight gently streamed through the leaves, casting golden beams across the path David usually took to work. The weight of guilt still pressed heavily on his chest from the night before, and every step felt burdened with the crushing weight of remorse. As he approached the vast garden outside the mansion, he stopped in his tracks. Under a large tree, Helen knelt on the grass. Her thin shoulders shook with each sob, her hands tightly clasped together in prayer, her chapped lips whispering broken words. "I'm sorry, Anna. Please forgive me," she repeated over and over, her tears glistening on her pale, exhausted face. David felt his throat tighten, and his legs seemed to be frozen in place. He wanted to move closer, but the shouting shame inside him kept him rooted. "Helen!" he called softly, his voice hoarse and broken. Helen turned her head, her eyes red and swollen from crying. When she saw David, a flicker of fear crossed her face, as if she was bracing herself for another punishment. I I don't deserve your pity," she choked out, her voice small and fragile. "Please, just treat me as you did before. I deserve it." But David couldn't reveal the truth just yet. He couldn't bring himself to say it, at least not now. The guilt weighed heavily in his chest, a storm brewing and raging within him, yet fear clutched at his heart. The truth he had discovered last night, that it had been another nurse who poisoned Anna, was still too raw and painful to speak out loud. How could he admit that he had tormented an innocent person, driven by his own wrongful judgments? "Helen, I'm sorry," David whispered, his gaze full of sorrow. "I can't keep punishing you anymore." Helen stared at him, stunned by the sudden change. She couldn't comprehend what had caused him to soften so unexpectedly. Deep down, she still didn't believe she deserved forgiveness. She lowered her head, her voice barely audible. "I don't understand, David. Why are you different now?" David's heart ached. He wanted to confess the truth, to tell her that she was not the one at fault, that he had been wrong all along. But the words seemed to choke him. He couldn't face the reality of his actions and couldn't bring himself to speak. The fear that he would never be forgiven haunted him. Instead of confessing, David reached out a hand, a silent gesture of reconciliation. I I just need time," he said, his voice trembling. "Please, give me some time." Helen looked at him, her eyes filled with pain but lacking any resistance. She didn't understand him, but she didn't fight it. "I will wait," she replied, her voice cracked. "If that's what you want." David felt a crushing weight on his chest. Sitting in his office, David's eyes were bloodshot from sleepless nights. Papers and documents lay scattered across his desk, but he couldn't focus on any of them. All he could think about was the terrible truth he had discovered. The image of Helen praying beneath the tree haunted him. How much pain had she endured because of him? How many nights had she spent on the cold, hard ground, suffering at the hands of a man who thought himself a victim? David remembered the times he had made her kneel all night in the hallway, the icy stone floor biting into her skin. There had been a storm once, and he hadn't even let her take shelter. Helen had sat there, curled up and shivering, but she hadn't uttered a single complaint. The rain had poured down her face, mingling with her endless tears. "You'll know what it felt like for Anna to die in pain, cold, and despair," David had said, his voice devoid of any compassion. Now, remembering those moments, he felt a surge of self-loathing. His anger had turned into a hatred directed at himself. He had become a monster, unworthy of the love and sacrifice Anna had once given him. One morning, as gentle sunlight poured through the window, David stood outside Helen's room, unsure whether he should enter. Helen looked frail, worn down by the months of torment, but she still tried to keep her spirit alive. She tended to a small garden beside the mansion, a place that had once been Anna's sanctuary. Whenever David saw the vibrant flowers, the memories of his sister would rush back, bringing with them a torrent of pain and guilt. Helen looked up when she saw David approaching, her eyes guarded and full of hurt. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice gentle but distant. David walked slowly toward her, his eyes no longer cold and harsh but filled with hesitation and sorrow. "I want to talk," he said, his voice low and unsteady. He had thought about getting on his knees and begging for forgiveness, but his pride and shame held him back. Helen gazed at him, her eyes filled with exhaustion and heartbreak. "What did I do to deserve your punishment, David?" she asked, her voice catching in her throat. "I loved Anna, and if I could have taken her place, I would have. But you never believed me." David was silent, the pain tearing through his chest as he listened to her words. His throat felt dry, and his heart pounded. He couldn't fathom how much hurt he had caused her. "I was wrong, Helen," he whispered, his eyes brimming with regret. "I misunderstood you. I hurt you out of my own grief, but now I know. You didn't cause Anna's death. The one who poisoned Anna was that nurse, the dark-skinned one. I was blind and cruel, and I'm so sorry." Helen said nothing, but her tears streamed down her cheeks. She had dreamed of the day David would realize the truth, but now that it was here, she didn't know how to feel. After all she had endured, it felt as though a part of her had been permanently broken. "You say I'm not guilty," Helen whispered, her voice cracking. David took a deep breath, his shoulders shaking. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But I promise, I'll do everything I can to make amends. I'll do whatever it takes to prove that I'm truly sorry, to show you that I was wrong and want to make things right." As David's words spilled out, revealing that she wasn't the one responsible for Anna's death, Helen felt as if the world around her had suddenly stopped. She stood still, unable to believe what she had just heard. Her heart seemed to stop, then race wildly in her chest. A complex wave of emotions surged within her: shock, relief, but also a deep, lingering pain and disbelief. Helen had lived so long under the crushing weight of guilt, believing she had caused the death of the woman she loved as a sister. She had accepted David's punishments because she thought she deserved them, that it was the price she had to pay for her mistakes. But now, knowing she was innocent, the pain ripped through her anew. She didn't know how to accept this new reality. All the torment, all the nights spent in agony and nightmares, had all been due to a misunderstanding. She clenched her fists, her whole body trembling. I didn't kill Anna," Helen whispered, her voice breaking as tears blurred her vision. "Then why did I have to suffer all of this? Why me?" The release from guilt didn't come as Helen thought it would. Instead, it left a void, a deep wound that wasn't easy to fill. Helen felt like she was drifting in a vast ocean, with nothing to hold on to. Relief was mingled with the aching pain of loss and the suffering she had endured all this time. She wasn't sure if she could ever forgive David, but one thing she knew for certain was that her heart had never stopped mourning for Anna, and now she needed to find a way to heal her own wounds. The silence between them seemed to stretch on forever, broken only by the soft whisper of the wind and the gentle swaying of flowers under the sunlight. Helen wasn't sure if she could ever forgive David, but she saw in his eyes a genuine sorrow, a sincerity she had never noticed before. And perhaps that could be the first step toward healing for both of them. David began to change. He tried to care for her, even though she kept her distance and never let him get too close. He had the room she once slept in on the cold floor cleaned and arranged, a proper bed with warm blankets put in. He brought her tea, though Helen never drank it right away. She eyed the tea with suspicion, as if it might still be poisoned. "You don't trust me, do you?" David asked, his voice pained. Helen didn't answer. She just stared into the teacup, her gaze distant. David realized that he had shattered her trust completely. He knew it would take a long time, perhaps a lifetime, to rebuild that trust. Even though nothing seemed to be getting better, David didn't give up. He quietly watched Helen from a distance, his heart aching as he saw her bow her head, trying to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. One afternoon, as Helen tended to a small injured puppy in the garden, David approached her. "You always care for everything, even when they don't deserve it," David said, his voice filled with emotion. Helen looked up at him. "No one is undeserving of love," she replied. "Anna taught me that." Hearing his sister's name felt like a dagger to David's heart. He couldn't hold back the tears as he thought about Anna, who had given so much to make the world a better place. "You know," David whispered, "Anna was the most important person in my life. She did everything for others, and all I wanted was to avenge her." Helen nodded. "I know. I wanted to protect Anna too. She saved me when I had nothing." They stood there in a shared, sorrowful silence. The sense of loss and grief connected them, yet it also kept them apart, an unbridgeable chasm. As time passed, David and Helen learned to coexist in the house that bore so many painful memories. One day while David was sitting in his office, Helen came in, her eyes gentle but resolute. "I want to leave," she said firmly. David fought to hold back his anguish upon hearing Helen's decision. He knew he had no right to stop her, no right to beg her to stay after everything he had done. Yet his heart clenched at the thought of losing her, the girl he had once punished out of hatred, but now knew deserved peace and happiness. "You have nowhere to go, do you?" David asked, his voice trembling. "Stay here, Helen. This is Anna's home, and Anna always wanted you to be happy. This house is your home too." Helen bowed her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Maybe I would have left the moment I learned I wasn't the one who poisoned Anna," she said quietly, but with determination. "But you know, Anna was as important to me as my own family, and you are her brother. I don't think Anna would ever want her brother to be consumed by so much pain. That's why I stayed, hoping I could somehow help you." David clenched his fists, his heart racked with guilt and remorse. What had he done to this kind, gentle girl, all because of his own misunderstanding and pain? Helen took a deep breath, her eyes still glistening with tears, but now holding a newfound strength. "But I need time, David. I need space to heal, to let go of these wounds, to find a way to forgive you. I can't stay here when every memory in this place haunts me." David nodded even though it felt like his heart was breaking. He understood that keeping Helen there would only cause her more pain. "I won't stop you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But know that I'll always be here, waiting for the day you can forgive me, and the day you might choose to come back, if you want to." Helen turned and walked out of the room, and this time David felt no anger or bitterness. He felt only emptiness, yet he knew that letting her go was the first step toward redemption and healing for them both. Time moved slowly after Helen left, and David was consumed by deep regret. Each day he felt the void in the house that had once been filled with pain and hatred he had inflicted. To make amends, he began a journey not only to honor the memory of his sister Anna, but also to save his own soul from the darkness. David established a charitable foundation in Anna's name, dedicated to supporting volunteer doctors in remote and underserved areas, just like Anna had done for the last 5 years of her life. He became personally involved in the projects, unafraid to get his hands dirty, building field hospitals and funding resources for those who work tirelessly to save lives. Every time he thought of Anna's smile, he felt his resolve strengthen, as if her spirit was watching over him, encouraging him to continue. One morning, David stood silently before the wall, honoring the volunteer doctors who had dedicated their lives to the mission of healing the world. Anna's name was carefully engraved there, like an eternal flame. He touched her name, feeling the lingering sense of loss still burning in his heart. But he also felt a sense of relief, knowing he was finally doing something right. "David!" A familiar voice rang out, gentle and soft. David turned and his heart seemed to stop. Standing before him was Helen, beautiful and radiant, with a strength he had never seen in her before. Her eyes no longer held coldness or fear. Instead, they shone with confidence and an inner peace she had found. David could hardly believe his eyes. She had returned. "Helen," he whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. Are you okay?" Helen nodded slightly, her lips curving into a gentle smile. "I've found myself," she said, her gaze clear. "And now I'm ready to face you, and the past." David stood frozen, unable to stop the smile that spread across his face. He felt a gentle breeze pass by, as if Anna was somewhere nearby, smiling down on them. In that moment, without needing to say anything more, they just looked at each other. Their eyes held an understanding that required no words, as if, at last, the old wounds had begun to heal. David took a deep breath, feeling a newfound lightness in his heart. "I've waited for this day," he admitted, "but I never dared to hope you would come back." Helen stepped forward, her eyes no longer holding resentment, but only gentleness. "I forgave you a long time ago," she said, "but I also needed time to forgive myself, to understand that neither of us deserved to be imprisoned by the past forever." David nodded, gratitude flooding his heart. "You've become so much stronger," he said, unable to hide his admiration. "And I'm still learning how to be a better person, to be worthy of your forgiveness and Anna's." They stood there under the warm morning sunlight, with a glimmer of hope shining in their hearts. There was no need to rush. The road ahead was still long, but at least they had begun a new journey. A journey not just to heal the past, but to rebuild the broken pieces of their lives. And perhaps they would find redemption, not only in each other's eyes, but in their commitment to live a life worth honoring, just as Anna had always wanted for both of them.